There have been a lot of names who have passed through the halls of the WWE over the years, and because of that, there are a lot of performers who failed to make a splash there. After all, not everyone can succeed. There just isn't enough room. The reasons these wrestlers' runs are short-lived can differ from person to person, of course, but the end result is always the same. Not long after they arrive, they're gone. But who are the biggest examples of failed runs in WWE history? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now. And where better to start than with one of the most notable examples of this, Kaval. Now, we don't say this is a notable example of a wrestler failing in WWE because Kaval was such a bright, burning star or anything. No, he was never booked to be anything more than a mid-carder during his short stay there. But the man behind the gimmick, Brandon Silvestri, most certainly was a notable figure elsewhere, as pretty much everywhere else he wrestled under the name of Lowkey. Yes, as a three-time IWGP Junior Heavyweight Champion, one-time ROH World Champion, one-time PWG World Champion, and the winner of the 2008 Battle of Los Angeles tournament, Lowkey had certainly built an impressive resume by the time he signed on the dotted line with WWE in 2008. And so it was expected that even if he wasn't the biggest guy in the world, he would still be destined for great things within the WWE system, as his skills in the ring were just that good. Unfortunately for him though, once he signed with WWE, it soon became clear anything he'd done in the past didn't matter to Vince McMahon, as rather than send the Brooklyn native straight up to the main roster and let him wow crowds with his talents there, the boss instead renamed him Kaval and shipped him down to Florida Championship Wrestling, the precursor to NXT. And while Kaval would have some degree of success there, primarily by becoming a Florida Tag Team Champion with Michael McGillicuddy, things quickly fell back down to earth again once he was handpicked to be a contestant on the second season of NXT. Why was this such a disaster? Well, because back then, NXT was still in its early game show format, not the kind of format which was best suited for highlighting an excellent indie wrestler's talents. That said, even if it didn't show him in his best light, Kaval still managed to win the tournament. And because of this, he'd be moved up to SmackDown, where he quickly found himself getting a shot at Dolph Ziggler's Intercontinental title. So things were looking up, right? Well, no, because almost immediately after losing this title shot, Kaval would be released from his contract. And while the reason for this isn't fully clear, we can take a pretty good guess as to why it happened. After all, Lowkey has had a long reputation of being difficult to work with behind the scenes, and we can imagine this kind of attitude didn't fly well with Vince McMahon and company, especially if they only saw the performer in question as being a mid-card act. So like that then, the time of Kaval in WWE came to an end. But at least he can take solace in the fact that he wasn't the only wrestler failing to make a splash in the Fed around about this time, as this was also the period we were seeing the quick rise and fall of DJ Gabriel. Who was DJ Gabriel? Well, if you were watching Raw or SmackDown back in the late 2000s, then you probably won't remember him. If, however, you were watching WWE CW back then, you might. Yes, this Berkshire native was supposed to be one of the breakout stars of the formerly Extreme brand once he debuted there in 2008. Could Gabriel have been more if he'd been given a better hand to play? Maybe. But then again, maybe not, as whenever he appeared on TV, he always gave off that vibe of being a creator wrestler. And this certainly wasn't helped by the fact that he was saddled with the dreaded dancing gimmick either. But then, even before the dancing gimmick, he already looked like he was going to struggle to get over in any meaningful way, something his 3 years spent in Florida Championship Wrestling prior to that proved. So when his WWE CW tag team partner and manager Alicia Fox was sent up to SmackDown in 2009 and he wasn't, it should have served as a warning sign that bad news was going to be coming his way in the near future. And this bad news ended up being that, following another brief demotion back down to FCW, where he'd be tasked with playing the role of Mr. FCW, DJ Gabriel was released from his contract in January of 2010. Yes, it was a sad end to his time in the WWE, but one we could see coming if we're being honest. And it would also pretty much mark the end of his in-ring career as a whole too, because a few indie dates aside, he'd never lace up his boots again. But this wouldn't be an issue for our next subject though, because once his time with WWE came to an end, he'd continue to work for places like TNA. Who are we talking about here? Why, Matt Morgan, of course. Now, Matt Morgan is a name you might remember if you were a fan of the Ruthless Aggression era SmackDown, as while the Fairfield native wasn't exactly a main eventer or anything, he did have a semi-notable run there between 2003 and 2005. The only problem was it was notable for all the wrong reasons, as rather than being treated like the big monster Vince McMahon more than likely saw him as, he'd instead be, for some reason, treated like a lower card act when he developed a stuttering gimmick. But let's backtrack a minute, because before the infamous stuttering gimmick ever became a thing, Morgan made his debut on the Blue brand as the newest member of Team Lesnar. And while you might think this association with the Beast would have been a good thing for him, in truth, it mostly amounted to him teaming up with Nathan Jones and looking like a jobber. So perhaps it shouldn't come as a surprise then that in 2004, he'd be shipped back down to Ohio Valley Wrestling, WWE's then developmental company, where he'd remain for the next year. Would the big man's time in OVW serve him well? No, because once he re-debuted on SmackDown in April of 2005, he would now have developed that speech impediment. And because of this, it was clear that the boss had now pegged him at a certain level, with this level being a semi-comedy geek whose main job was to serve as the backup for Carlito before he was ultimately fired later that year. Still, at least Matt Morgan got to continue wrestling as part of the TNA roster for a few years once this happened, so it wasn't all bad. And as it happens, it was there he'd share a locker room with our next subject, someone who had a short-lived run in WWE of their own during the late 2010s, Jaxson Ryker. Don't remember Jaxson Ryker? That's okay. He didn't do much during his time with the Fed, to be honest, so we don't blame you. In fact, most of his time there was spent in NXT as part of a stable which was literally called the Forgotten Sons on account of the fact so many people had overlooked them. And with the Forgotten Sons never really having any stories worthy of note on the Black and Gold brand or any title success, there's not really that much to say about them. What there is more to say about, however, is the group's run on SmackDown starting in April of 2020. Though this isn't necessarily for the best of reasons. Why is that? Well, after making an initial splash there by laying waste to then SmackDown Tag Team Champions The New Day, Rker very quickly got himself into trouble behind the scenes. So with him making few friends backstage, WWE felt the best thing to do was to pull the North Carolinian off of TV for a while. And when he returned a few months after that, it would no longer be as a part of the Forgotten Sons, rather it would be as a tag team partner and eventual rival to Elias over on Raw. How did this go for Rker? Not great, because after doing the job to Elias in a Symphony of Destruction match on the July 19th, 2021 episode of Raw, he'd be relegated to mostly appearing on Main Event. And this was where he would remain all the way up until he was cut from his contract on November 18th of the same year. Did he do anything afterwards? No, he's effectively retired now. The same fate which would await our next subject when she ended up parting ways with WWE in 2021 as well. Who are we talking about this time? Who else but Kavita Devi? What was the Indian-born former powerlifter doing during her run in WWE? Well, after being recommended to the company by the great Khali, Devi would be announced as part of the former year's Mae Young Classic tournament. And this made perfect sense, as with such a tournament requiring a lot of female talent, WWE were on the lookout for anyone who they could add to it. Unfortunately for the Haryana native, however, she'd end up losing in the first round here to Dakota Kai. And after that, it wasn't like she set the world on fire, because aside from making a cameo appearance at the WrestleMania 34 Women's Battle Royal and showing up at the occasional NXT live event to team up with Aaliyah, there was nothing much of note to be found in her run. Sure, she did enter herself into the 2018 Mae Young Classic, but once again, she'd be eliminated in the first round here, with her this time getting beaten by Caitlyn. Aside from that, Kavita Devi would be pretty much relegated to the role of brand ambassador when she was tasked with returning to her home country and there helping to get a WWE Indian Super League launched. As you can probably guess though, that league never got launched. And so, with no other purpose left to serve then, Devi was cut from her contract in May of 2021, ending her time not only in the WWE, but also seemingly in wrestling as a whole. Yes, it's a sad thing that so many short-lived stars of WWE just retire from the ring altogether once their time there ends, rather than trying out their luck somewhere else. We guess that's just what happens when there's only one big league in town for so many years though. But even having another firmly established major player in North American wrestling doesn't mean you'll be able to just walk through the door and get a job there once your time in WWE ends. And if you need any evidence of this, you only have to look at the story of our next subject, Quincy Elliott. Who was Quincy Elliott? Well, if you were watching NXT 2.0 between 2022 and 2023, then you might know the answer to this question is that he was an ambiguous mix of mid-90s Goldust and the Velveteen Dream. However, this one was just never quite enough to catch the attention of fans watching the show. Of course, it didn't help that when asked to wrestle against opponents such as Grayson Waller, Zion Quinn, or Scripps, Elliott quickly showed he wasn't the best in-ring worker, with this doing little to help endear him to live audiences. So really, we should have all seen the writing on the wall long before it was read out loud here. And that writing was telling us that this was a character which was never going to make it up to the main roster anytime soon. What no one could have foreseen, though, was how quickly the Super Divas time in WWE would end. After all, it looked like the company weren't fully done with him yet when he was suddenly released from his contract in September of 2023, just 9 days after the Endeavor sale was finalized. So what happened here? Well, if rumors are to be believed, it's been said that, like with Lowkey, Quincy Elliott was difficult to work with behind the scenes, making the Diva moniker all the more apt. And with AEW apparently not looking to sign him either, it means Quincy Elliott's time in the ring appears to have come to an end. But thankfully, the same can't be said for our next subject, because even when his time with WWE came to a close in 2021, he'd continue to thrive. Why is that? Well, because he's Killian Daye. Yes, how could someone with all the raw talent of Killian Daye, a man affectionately known in his home country as Big Damo, not succeed somewhere in wrestling? But wait, we hear you say, didn't Daye have a pretty good run in NXT as part of Sanity? Well, yes, the Belfast native did have some measure of success on the Black and Gold brand between 2016 and 2018, and then again between 2019 and 2021. As you can probably figure out though, the problem is that for his 5 years in WWE, only a few months of that was spent on the main roster, and that's the part of his run we're focusing on here. Why is this? Well, because Daye had all the potential to be a big star on SmackDown once he debuted there with the rest of Sanity in June of 2018, as he had everything required to be either a big monster heel or a lovable monster babyface. Alas though, such an eventuality was not meant to be in the end, as with Sanity immediately being treated like jobbers on the Blue brand, it wasn't long before they disappeared from TV for the remainder of 2018. And when they eventually did return again in April of 2019, their lone appearance would be to lose to The Miz of all people in a 3-on-1 Falls Count Anywhere match. That's right, Sanity weren't even considered good enough to beat The Miz in a 3-on-1 fight. So this pretty much killed any credibility they had left then, with it being immediately after that they were disbanded and Mr. Nikki Cross was sent back down to NXT, where he would spend the rest of his run with WWE before he was ultimately released in 2021. Should he have been more? Absolutely. But then who knows? With him currently being a member of the TNA roster, and with TNA having a working relationship with WWE, there's every possibility we see him return there again in the near future, perhaps to start an on-screen romance with his wife as an associate of sorts to the Wyatt Six. And if that happens, Big Damo might finally get the main roster run he deserves. One person who's unlikely to be getting that second bite of the apple anytime soon, though, is our next subject, Ichika Jiro. Yes, this run all started back in December of 2020. That was when Jiro Kiroshio, Tokyo-born star of Keiji Muto's Wrestle 1 promotion, signed with Vince McMahon and was immediately repackaged under his new name. Why Ichika Jiro? Well, in Japan, the word Ikemen is used as a shorthand for a good-looking man, and as Jiro considered himself a bit of a looker, it was perhaps no surprise he chose to go with this moniker. But would such a gimmick lead to success for him in WWE? Well, that depends on how you define success, because on both 205 Live and NXT 2.0, he would have some lows in the form of losses to Tony Nese, Arya Daivari, and Duke Hudson, as well as some highs like his tag team run with junior heavyweight legend Kushida. No, the pair never won any gold or anything, but for the period that Jacket Time was together, they did get to put on some good matches. That said, this success would be ultimately short-lived, because once Kushida decided to leave WWE in 2022 in order to return to his old home of New Japan, the writing was on the wall for Ichika Jiro, as he was very clearly the Jannetty of the pairing. So by the time September of 2023 came around then, he must have been expecting it when WWE announced that they were going to be cutting him from his contract. Not that this was the end of the world for the Tokyo native though, as since then he's returned to Japan himself though in his case, he hasn't been wrestling for New Japan, rather he's been wrestling for All Japan and DDT instead. Yes, one of the benefits of being from the East and failing to make a splash in America is that you can always go back home if need be and pick up where you left off there. It's just a shame the same couldn't be said for our next subject then when he left WWE in 2005, Heiden Reich. That's right, Heiden Reich. One of the primest examples of Vince McMahon's love for muscle men during the mid to late 2000s. Really, we're not surprised he never made much of an impact in WWE, not because his boss wasn't willing to give him plenty of chances, but because there was no way he was going to be able to stand up to the likes of Eddie Guerrero, Kurt Angle, and Rey Mysterio when it came to going in the ring. Still, that didn't mean there wasn't a solid attempt made to get him over after he debuted in September of 2003, though for some reason, WWE thought the best way to do this back then was to give him the gimmick of a man being controlled by an unseen entity named Little Johnny. That's right, it was a bizarre one. Would it be so bizarre as to mean he couldn't get over with fans though? Well, yes, because despite getting into a high-profile feud with The Undertaker in August of 2004, the crowd went mild every time Heiden Reich came through the curtain. And his backstage segments would be even worse because they would usually revolve around him angrily reading poetry to people. So bad was it, in fact, that even when the big man was repackaged as the newest tag team partner of Road Warrior Animal in the summer of 2005, fans couldn't care less. And so realizing that there was no fixing things at this point, WWE decided to part ways with Heiden Reich in January of 2005, only days after he had his last match on an episode of Velocity. What would he do from there? Not a great deal. He did wrestle for a brief time for Puerto Rico's World Wrestling Council, and at one point he had an infamous match against a Doink the Clown impersonator in a Golden Corral parking lot. But most people weren't paying attention to any of that. No, by then, they'd already forgotten about Heiden Reich and his brief time in the wrestling world. But let's move away from the 2000s for now and back to the 90s instead, as it's then our next subject had his short-lived run with WWF. That's right, it's time to talk about Kurrgan. Now, when someone says the word Kurrgan, your mind is going to go to one of two places depending on what kind of person you are and what your major fandom is. If you're a movie fan, then you're probably going to think of the villain from Highlander. If you're an Attitude Era wrestling fan, however, you're likely going to first think of the giant from the Oddities who was played by French-Canadian Robert Mallet. Yes, well, he certainly had the size required to be a star in WWF during its peak years of popularity. Kurrgan's time there was pretty short-lived, all things considered. Why was this? Well, like with other giants, such as Giant Gonzalez or the Great Khali, the sheer size of Mallet meant he couldn't really do much in the ring. So instead of being pushed as a main event heel, the Ontario native was used as one of many members of the Truth Commission once that stable was brought in during 1997 by the Jackal, aka AEW's Don Callis. And while this allowed him to stay on the apron as much as possible while his teammates did most of the work, it also meant he didn't get any better. No, if anything, he regressed. And that meant once the Truth Commission was disbanded a few months later, the only place left for Kurrgan to go was the Oddities, a late 90s wrestling freak show which also included the likes of Golga, Giant Silva, Luna Vachon, and for some reason, the Insane Clown Posse. Obviously then, this allowed him little opportunity to do anything else except appear in the odd 24/7 tier segment on Raw. And because of that, once it was time for cuts to be made in early 1999, the big man would find his head on the chopping block. Would he achieve anything after this? Yes and no, because while he wouldn't wrestle much anymore, Mallet would make a nice career for himself as an actor in movies such as 300, Sherlock Holmes, and Deadpool 2, with this being a career path he has maintained to this day. So it just goes to show, even if you don't have a lengthy run in WWE, it doesn't have to be the end of the world. No, as most of the people we've looked at today have shown, there can still be life after the Fed, even if your time there has since gone forgotten for the most part.